Meanings of theory, and my name is Alvesson, and I'm working a lot with Jörgen Sandberg. That means sand mountain in English. And this presentation is partly based on, I've added a bit, but partly based on a paper that we published in Journal of Management Studies almost this very hour, at least very recently. So if you're quick, you can have a competitive advantage and be in front of your competitors on the academic market for referring to novel stuff and so on. And we discussed then some problems of how we understand and relate and mean by theory. Of course, theory is something that is something that we are supposed to be working with as academics. In other areas in life, then that's just a theory, people may say, and be a bit pejorative about that, speculative and loose, and not founded in reality, and so on. But as academics, we are supposed to work with theory and develop that. That's the finest thing you can do, according to some people. The problem is it's a bit vague what we mean by theory, and we observe that or claim that without rather clear understanding of what theory stands for, what we mean by theory, it's a bit difficult to develop theory, and it's also difficult to evaluate it. So given that it's important to work with theory and to do studies that is not just empirical description or hypothesis testing, it can be part of the building or revision of theory. We need to work with some idea of what do we mean by theory, and also, of course, methods for developing this. And why is theory important? Well, it is a key element in how we think. It gives us cognitive support. It helps us structure our understandings of reality. It helps us reason as academics. It guides empirical studies. Even if you're working inductively, you sooner or later need to have some support by theory as a dialogue partner or as interpretive support. And of course, good theory can also be relevant for practitioners. So it may guide practice, particularly more reflexive practice. So theory is hopefully something that is useful and we can work with. It's a celebratory term. So theory is often something highbrow. Intelligent people with a big forehead, they are into theory, and it's easy that it stays like a celebratory term and not having so much of distinct meaning that is helpful to work with. I get the feeling there's a lot of pseudo-theoretical contributions or theoretical pseudo-contributions, so that people can camouflage their lack of clear insights or clear good reasoning through doing certain things, such as coming up with new labels for phenomena or engaged rather abstract and vague thinking that people don't understand, but it may give the impression of being very theoretical. We live in an academic class society, and we have people on different levels. We have the verification proletariat, people that only send out questionnaires, and people that are into theory development and theory building and don't ever necessarily have to leave their armchair when they do research. And then we have different positions in between here. I see myself as belonging to the upper middle class in terms of all this. So I work with empirical material, but not in the kind of bourgeoisie or low middle class grounded theory style, but more in terms of creating ideas and being somewhat more bold in efforts to develop new concepts and new ideas. So, but theory is something that one should strive for in case one would like to make a career and move upward in the academic caste system. So what does theory mean and what does it stand for? Belongs to all these concepts that are frequently in circulation, but seldom very clearly specified or defined. So even though everybody agrees this is important and fine and good and the criteria for publishing, at least in the highly ranked journals, there is a need, we feel, Jörgen Sandberg and I, for further clarification of the meaning of theory. A lot of people, they do complain about how ambiguous the use of this term is. There's a lot of varied meanings around what theory stands for, but also if you have one type of meaning, it's sometimes rather vague or ambiguous what people actually mean by this. And a lot of journals, when they demand a theoretical contribution for consideration for publication, it's not particularly clear what they mean, and that may be an advantage of being a bit unclear sometimes because you give some space and some degrees of freedom, but it shouldn't be too much of all this, I think. Here's one citation by Dennis Turish. It seems reasonable to expect some standard definition that tells us what theory is in fine detail. I haven't found this to be the case. Rather, there are plentiful definitions that are characterized by their vagueness. And here I must confess that I'm not certain that we are not guilty of this ourselves, but perhaps we push thinking and development to some extent in the right direction. Perhaps can't be too sure about that. Theory is a concept or term that could be qualified as a hembygg. This is a new concept that we have invented, hembygg concepts. I like concept knacking. And a hembygg is then a hegemonic, ambiguous, big term. So hegemonic, it means that it's there, it's seen as common sense, it's very persuasive, it's hard to avoid. So everybody seems to be dragged into this kind of theory interest or theory focus. But it's very ambiguous and loose, and it's also a big term that tends to just swell and be used in all different ways. If you're interested in hembygg theory, then you can have a look at our recently published piece in Human Relations by myself and Martin Blom on hegemonic ambiguous big terms. So theory is something that we should work with in terms of trying to define or specify, or at least zoom in. We are on Zoom now, and therefore it's appropriate to try to work with zooming in, not only an audience participants here, but also the kind of phenomena that we're after, and this is theory. Theory is often seen as something that is about explanation. And a lot of people take that for granted, that theory is something that explains a particular phenomenon. And if people take something for granted and all accept that, that can mean that everybody is right, but it can also mean that everybody is a bit stupid, lazy, and thought about possible alternatives or distinctions, or thought through the topic carefully enough. And I always agree on something, they probably may be wrong, or at least they tend to miss certain possibilities in terms of thinking and making distinctions, and see something that is a bit beyond then common sense and the conventional one. But a lot of people, they use this explanatory kind of view on theory. It's one, Saturn and Stowe, I think it's an ASQ, 1995. A theory is a systematically related set of statements, including some law-like generalizations that explains why event structure and thoughts occur. Pentland says something similar. Explanation is a story that describes the process or sequence of events that connects cause and effect. So a lot of people, they assume that theory means explanatory theory, and there's about causal relationships. So then one could assume that that is something really to stick to. This is the meaning of theory, and if we stick to that, we have a stable ground for further thinking and so on. But not necessarily. We would argue that equating theory with explanatory knowledge leads to several problems and shortcomings. One is that they tend to exclude or privilege one approach to knowledge and research and theory development over alternative ones. So this means a form of domination if you don't allow space for alternatives. So it limits the way we think intellectually about issues. It stifles other ways of theorizing. And if we do that, then the collective knowledge tend to be rather impoverished, because we live in a world that is quite complicated and multidimensional. There's a multitude of different phenomena, and also a multitude of different ways of producing phenomena of interest for us to study. And if we only go for explanations and causal relations, that can be seen as a source not of rationality and rigor and other good things, but also the source of impoverishment. So we think it's important then to push for some level of multidimensionality around how we think about theory. And then even emancipate ourselves from one particular view based on certain assumptions of the world, being full of causal mechanisms and relations and being explainable. So if we can liberate from that kind of dominant understanding, still having respect for that approach, I think, of course, that's very respectable, and it's important that people do explanatory kind of theory development, but perhaps there are alternatives, and we should be more open-minded and pluralistic in these respects. And I'm just, for those that really are into dominant views, pointing out that there's a lot of people that are seen as intellectual stars, really influential thinkers that have used the concept of theory in totally different ways. One is Jürgen Habermas, one of the most influential thinkers during the last 50 years, or 60 years, even 70 years perhaps, is now very old. The still living great elephant, I think. All the other superstars in social science, they are now dead. But Habermas is still alive, and he published recently an extremely thick book on thinking, philosophical thinking. And he developed some time ago the theory of communicative action, with an alternative understanding of rationality. And Habermas' idea is that all the time that we use language, that we make a statement in text or talk, that statement includes or is based on 4 validity claims: that the speaker or the writer is A, understandable, B, honest, C, is kind of truthful or can back up the statement with some empirics or some other indicators of this being true. And the 4th element is this is normatively correct or can be defended in terms of legitimate moral claims. And Habermas' idea is that these validity claims, they're always included in communication, and then people can start to question this and ask for validation of these claims. And then you have like communicative action, where people try to sort out what is a reasonable an acceptable argument. And if that takes place in a dialogue, in a critical dialogue, then he refers to that as undistorted communication. The problem is that in life there are politics, there are ideologies, there are power relationships, and a lot of distortions, making this undistorted communication and emergence of communicative rationality, leading to then people agreeing on things based on the strength and soundness of arguments. That is his idea, and it's like a clear theoretical framework then for understanding the meaning of rationality of another kind than the instrumental rationality the normal is dominating. Optimizing means in order to accomplish goals that are aimed for. So this is Habermas' theory of communicative action, which is very influential, but it's not an explanatory theory. It's extremely helpful and relevant and important intellectual work, and it is best described as theory, but it's not about explanation. And if we go for the dominant definitions of theory, then we miss, at least in terms of labeling theory, some extremely important types of intellectual work that presumably are best labeled theory, including then Habermas, and the same with work by Foucault and others that are not into what management scholars may like to define as theory. So, and when we think about what we are interested in relating to, we can get some support from a Swedish sociologist called Johan Asplund. He never published in English because he was very eager to have beautiful texts, and then with translations, then it becomes, when I write something, it becomes slightly Swinglish. Swinglish, that is Swedish English. You can hear that from my accent that I'm from Sweden. We speak English a bit like this, unfortunately, but it could be worse. And so it's never been translated, but we have used his work in a number of books and articles, so published in English then. And Asplund, he said that normally social scientists are interested in a phenomenon, and then ask questions such as what causes the phenomenon, or what is caused by the phenomenon. And the phenomenon can be anything like management control system, or leadership act, or HR policy, or whatever. Or a merger, or what you want. But most people ask questions like that, and also how frequent is the phenomenon and what is it correlated with. So you have the phenomenon, and then, okay, what errors point to the phenomenon and what errors point from the phenomenon, and between before and after, there may be other intermediate variables as part of the picture. But Asplund says that this misses the key question, and that's not how many, what causes, what is caused by the phenomenon, but what is the meaning of the phenomenon? What is its key quality? What is it all about? What's the underlying nature of a particular phenomenon? So this is then the key question. And this is very much a theoretical question, because you need to consider various abstractions, how to really develop a good understanding, precise kind of notion around what is this all about. And one could argue this is what theory is about. now it says here that the stable is a bit uncertain, but hopefully you can hear me most of the time at least. I rely on Ibrat to raise his finger if something is temporarily lost, and I can try to repeat it. And one can make a distinction here between two various quite different views on theory. And one is then work with boxes and arrows. The bat view on theories. We have tried to have the boxes and arrows, and then enough boxes and enough arrows pointing in the right direction, and then you have like an explanation for a particular phenomenon. Why people are absent from work, or why they moan and groan and complain a lot, or why they make a different commitment, or why they're switching their jobs or careers or whatever. Boxes and arrows theories. But then an alternative then is meaning exploration theory, MET. So bet versus MET are two alternatives. And the meaning exploration theory, you go more into the phenomenon. And you ask questions, what is this all about? How can I carve out some conceptualization, some good understanding, some grasping of something here that is not obvious? And then you go in rather than correlate this. And that means that it's not so much about boxes and arrows anymore. So an example of this, an HRM system. You can look at the system. We actually did a study of an HRM system in a large management IT consulting firm. And they had a lot of HR, enormous amount, not so much in the specific department, but all people there were supposed to do this. It was a feedback culture. They gave systematic feedback to junior people all the time after every bloody project being finished. They have very careful then assessments of their qualities, a lot of training, education, extensive procedures before these endless promotions that were taking place, when people went from analyst to manager and senior manager and so on. So they had very large apparatus and very much time and resources being invested in all this. And of course, you can look at, here you have the ambitious HR system, and what is causing this, or what is the outcomes of this, how does all this HRM feedback and promotion assessments and training and whatever, weight setting and so on, how does it influence competence and promotions in terms of being right or wrong, satisfaction of people, extra effort or trust in the company, or loyalty or whatever. So you can see, here's the system and what are the outcomes of this, and you can compare that company perhaps with another with less or different forms of all this. And then you can produce a theory based on causal relationships. Okay? But you can also do something else, and that was what we were doing. We found out that this fantastic, ambitious system, it worked so and so. A lot of feedback, kind of weak or ambiguous, or sometimes a bit sloppy and not particularly precise. One junior consultant said that he got the feedback from his manager that you should report to me a bit more what you're doing so I can assess you better. So the feedback was that I can't really assess what you're doing because you have a lot of people, you don't know exactly what they're doing, so it's a bit difficult with all this. And promotion, sometimes people couldn't understand how comes that chap is being promoted and not that one, and so on. So this enormous rational system, it worked so and so in terms of of its claimed precision. So we thought, why are they doing this? They still had a lot of kind of hope and fantasies and ambitions and like to tell everybody about this fantastic HR and how great they were in really optimizing human resources. It didn't work, was our finding, according to their own precise stories, but still they had this kind of faith in all this. So ask the question, what's the meaning of this? How can we understand this? Or the gigantic, ambitious HR system, and people still, despite all good reasons to doubt it, faith in it. And then we come up with HR, at least in this case, it's not about producing particular effects in the sense that you normally would assume if you are slightly naive or explanation-oriented, perhaps HR person. But the point with all these massive investments and activities and so on is that fuels organizational storytelling. And it fuels people's identity constructions. So why should clients pay a huge amount of money to use a particular IT management consulting firm? Well, there may be good reasons. It's often difficult to know exactly what is the outcome of this in terms of savings and so on, because so many things are happening all the time, and you can't really inspect IT management consulting firm what in terms of product quality and so on. You have to it's a leap of faith. But that leap is much smaller if there is enormous amount of indications or good sales stories about we being a fantastic firm. We really have the best and the brightest people, and we really cultivate and process our human resources so carefully. So here you can really trust us. It is a strong part of the branding, sales argument. It's a key element in organizational storytelling. So we see here HRM as not about conventional stuff necessarily, but very much about producing the basis material for a narrative of the firm. And this, of course, means that there's an organizational identity construction of this, and it's also a construction of the identities of the consultants. So if you start work, they are relatively young, a bit innocent perhaps, a bit insecure, but then you have all this HR, and it provides you with some security and a stabilizer of your identity. As one person said, I know that I've been hired by this company. I know that I've exposed to enormous amount of assessment and feedback and selective promotion and so on. Therefore, I feel that I belong to the best and the brightest. It's a very strong identity booster. Then if all this works or not, as people may believe, that's a secondary issue. But in terms of identity construction, then it definitely worked in this firm, despite all the signs of this not being as precise as one would perhaps expect, because life is full of ambiguities and politics and wild guesses about what people are doing and their qualities, etc., etc. So this is an example then of theory, and we published this in Organizational Science 2007, me and then Kärman. So it's seen as having a theoretical contribution, but it's not of the explanatory kind. Or at least we don't see it as best described by how people normally define theory of the explanatory type. So this is an example of a meaning exploration theory. And if you read some of my stuff, there's a lot of that being published in journals and books and so on. It tends always to be met theory, meaning exploration theory. So we try to explore what's happening in the organizational change not explain, but indicate what's happening there. We try to understand the meaning of leadership. What do people mean by leadership? What is it all about, and so on. So that's a lot of examples on MET theory, meaning exploration theory. But these are the two extremes. So you have BAT stuff, and then you have MET stuff, and then of course there are a lot of things somewhere in between all this.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Your internet connection seems to be unstable, so that's why your voice usually breaking. So, do you think you can make it more stable? Then you can. We don't lose what you say.
Well, I don't think I can do so much about this. I'm sitting close to the router and so on. So I don't know if we have any solutions to this problem. I can repeat some statements if they seem as important to repeat, perhaps. But otherwise, I don't know what to do about this. Sorry.
You could consider connecting to the mobile data. So getting an internet from your mobile, it's typically more stable.
Yeah, I think it's probably a bit late now. I don't know. I'm not using mobile telephones so much, so I'm not. I don't think it's a connection to that either.
So maybe let's try to carry on, and we can ask Ibrat to step in if there will be something happening.
Yeah. So no, I think this is not an option at this very moment. We just continue and hope it will become better. So the way forward here is, I think when one is very much into pluralism, then it becomes easily a bit fluffy and uncertain, and then anything goes, which is not an option. So in our article, we say that we need to try to work with certain general features of theory, and then also give space for alternatives. So there are certain things that all people claiming to do theory, they should relate to, and but apart from these general characteristics, then open up for alternatives. And then we produce a typology that aims to clarify, broadens, and differentiates different meanings of theory. And later I will say a few words about the advantages of all this. So general definitions or criteria that more or less, I think we shouldn't overdo it in terms of expectations here either, but generally a theory, then it has a purpose. And I do think that clarifying the purpose is very important, and explaining, yeah, that can be one purpose, but general understanding, which is closer then to the meanings, to cultural phenomena, reasoning of people, and so on. That's a different type of focus. I can also have emancipation as a quality or a purpose of knowledge. And Habermas, of course, he worked with the cognitive interests or knowledge constitutive interests. So he separated between a technical, hermeneutical, and an emancipatory type of knowledge interest. But still, I can say that there should be a purpose, an aim, and that could be clarified. An explanation is only one of these. Theory should be related to a phenomenon, and sometimes people assume that there are given phenomena to study. The phenomena, they are out there. Let's study them and explain them, more or better, whatever. But we can also invent phenomena. And good theory means that we can come up with a novel phenomena. Of Of course, it's not pure fantasy, but it's not necessarily kind of carved out, or identified, or constructed as a phenomenon. Example could be garbage can decision making, or learned helplessness, or to narcissistically refer to my own small contribution to mankind with Anders Spice, then the stupidity, functional stupidity type of phenomenon. But it should be some kind of phenomenon, and hopefully a bit creatively produced. And theory means also some conceptual ordering mechanisms. So there should be distinctions and precisions in terms of describing this phenomenon, what is related to that. Theory should provide some intellectual insights, not just be commonsensical, but something that leads to some support for novel thinking, and hopefully makes the reader respond with an aha or wow. Ideas around relevance. So what? In what sense is this relevant, and for whom? I mean, sometimes there are complaints that theory is the end purpose of a lot of research, but it should normally be seen as leading to something else that we can understand, handle, act, whatever, for some purpose. And there's sometimes a problem if theory is the ultimate purpose, and then you have another contribution to institutional theory, that's great, but why? What is this useful for? Who benefits from this? What's the relevance, the social value of all this? And the problem is that a lot of research, it lacks clear answer to that question. Normally we assume that a theory should have some empirical support, but you can emphasize this more or less. So sometimes I would say that a good theory, if there's some intuitive feeling that this has some backup, that's fine. But not necessarily a lot of data. Sometimes good theory, it's always almost impossible to really prove it or support it strongly. I mean, 150 years, soon 120 years after psychoanalysis, it's still seen as a bit tricky then to relate exactly how strong is this empirical support. We need to have some ideas about when is a theory relevant and so on. What does it include, and what does it include? What are the boundary conditions of the theory? And hopefully it doesn't explain everything, because then it tends to be a bit too broad and a bit too vague and so on. So what we've done here is to try to carve out, to point at 5 major theory types. And this is hopefully not a straitjacket every time you produce a typology or come up with some number of distinctions. You open up an avenue, but you also close it. So I don't think that this is in any way the final word on all this. We only hope that this is a good way of summarizing some possible views on theory, and that can aid some people in their thinking. And for time reasons, this is well explained, I think, in the paper. So if you're interested in that, you can read the paper instead. I just very briefly mentioned that explaining theory, then you have typically phenomena more or less given out there. You try to explain this by establishing causal relationships. You work with boxes and arrows often. It's very much about having strong empirical support. So explanations that typically assume that the data can be the backbone of your theoretical reasoning, and you should be very careful of not stepping out of the data that drives theory, and then through hypothesis testing and so on should be the anchoring point in the theoretical work. And the insights is very much establishing the causal relations, often with variables and intermediating variables, and then you have various kind of outcomes and a lot of boxes and arrows like that. It's not directly my cup of tea, as you understand, so I may describe this without sufficient respect. Another type of approach is comprehending theory, and here you tend to move more into the phenomena. So the meanings and enactment that people are into is important. You don't have so much of external relations and causal relationships than how people define and construct a particular situation. That is significant, and the theory work here, which not necessarily is formulated as theory, sometimes it's formulated as which account or thick description or something like that. But you very much circle around the meaning of the phenomenon. And the HR example that I mentioned before, that exemplifies this approach. Another theory type is enacting theory, and this is very much a processual view on things. So you don't assume that reality is full of a lot of entities or elements influencing others, but reality is much more processual. So, for example, gender is not like a structural phenomena. It's not necessarily something that is built into people's roles and attitudes and orientations. Gender is something that we do, something that we process. Doing gender rather than being gender is then a key element in all this. So enacting theory emphasizes then the processual logic, how we process reality in different ways. We don't necessarily have any stable meanings as comprehensive theory tend to assume, but we process this in different ways. Yes, and then I think I forgot one. We should have ordering theory also as one possibility. And here it's very much considering then the messiness and complicated nature of phenomena. And good theory makes it possible for us to make productive distinctions. We can see variation. So we can see that there is bureaucracy, and bureaucracy is over the place, but ordering theory then moves into bureaucracy and find interesting distinctions. Of course, there's some ordering theory that opens up different types of organizations, organizational control types like bureaucracy, like market solutions, output control, and then you have clans or cultures as ordering, structuring, controlling mechanisms. So sometimes you work like that, but with even more theoretical work, you go into distinctions, you make typifications, you find ideal types and sort out then how we can relate to various phenomena through showing how they hang together, but also how they are separate. And our ability to make productive distinctions about stuff is then the key element in all this. And then the final fifth type here is provoking theory. And that means that you are less interested in capturing the details of nitty-gritty empirical phenomena out there, but you try to look at how are we thinking about issues and how can we add to or add against that kind of thinking through mind stretching, trying to think differently about things, often with the idea of being critical or provocative or being doing emancipation. So the constructed nature of reality is taken seriously, and then you try to, okay, when we think about these issues, how can we theorize phenomena so that we get input then to to expand our mental horizons rather than be caught in the phenomena that we can observe and that we need to explain based on what the empirical nitty-gritties they tell us. So when it comes to gender, for example, one could say that there are two genders, and then you may add queer or transsexual or whatever category, but one can also imagine us thinking in terms of many genders based on biology, identification, people's various views, and so on here. So multiplying gender could be something that we could theorize about without necessarily being that constrained by the meanings and the facts or whatever that are easily then produced. So when we done the stuff on functional stupidity, of course, we had some empirical support, and that's always to some extent necessary. But the key element is much more to allow and encourage more dialectical or different types of thinkings about the phenomena that otherwise we may tend to be boiled down into and constrained by. So we can talk much more about this, but time is moving on, and I'll just exemplify this, the 5 approaches, by the example of values. So imagine that you are a young and innocent newcomer, PhD student, and you are very interested in values. Imagine that you are into explaining theory, then you may be interested in what affects people's values and what are the consequences of values. Values may be determined, they may be explained by gender, nationality, organization, top management style, organization cultures, or whatever. And then you may test various hypotheses, and then you may have an explanation for why people have certain types of values, like authoritarianism, for example. Or you can look at the consequences of these values. What are the effects of, for example, strongly shared values in a particular organization? Does it lead to a sense of direction, commitment, pride, people be feeling imprisoned, or whatever? So then you have like the phenomenon of values, and then you look at the various kind of causal relations to all this, and then you may produce an explaining theory around values as a key concept. Or you can have a comprehending theory, and then you look at how people define and relate to values, how meanings tend to inform, influence, guide them, or perhaps not so strongly guiding, but being loosely coupled to sense-making, decisions, choices in life, acts, and so on. But you go more into how are people relating then to meanings. What's the meaning of values for people in a particular group situation, particular individuals or whatever. So you're close to them, and you try to sort out theoretically this phenomena. Of course, there may be empirical study, but then it should lead to some concepts, some ways of reasoning around all this, some broad understanding, then transcending exactly how a particular group are into all this. Or if you're into ordering theory, then you look for distinctions. What type of values, what types of value commitments, perhaps? How can we unpack this notion of values? There may be espoused values. There may be values that people believe in. They don't espouse, but they believe in. There may be values in use that may be a bit different from values that people espouse, but also those that they believe in. There may be social expressions of values and so on. And then you have interesting distinctions and produce theoretical contributions through ordering and making typifications, typologies, and all this. Or you may be into enacting theory, where the ongoing processing of values is the target or the ambition for your theoretical contribution. So how is processing taking place? And of course, once again, it's part of an empirical question, but the idea with theory is that you assume that values are in process, and people's processing of this calls for some understanding, some theoretical ideas around value processing as perhaps a key concept. And then you may assume that people are not necessarily particularly consistent or stable in the use of values, but something else. Or to exemplify then the last point here about provocative theory, then we look at how we normally think about values, value statements, and then we may be interested in an alternative take on all this. Perhaps thinking about contemporary society, where we all are supposed to be customer-oriented, influenced by social media. We are targeted for enormous amount of management, marketing, social engineering efforts. And here we tend perhaps to be other-directed. And that was a theory by David Riesman a long time ago, claiming that modern person is increasingly other-directed. We are so sensitive to the social cues from our environments, so perhaps that leads to that values are very loosely held. And people may be into value jumping, politically, socially favorable values may be something that offer us position to take. But the stable, consistent, enduring values may be history. And then if you find that you have a good case for this, you may develop a theory around values as perhaps a myth or a rather cramped effort to stabilize identity through the notion of values. That could be just an example of provocative theory. And the idea is not necessarily to get all the empirical details correct or exactly mirror reality. One could say that, who knows, it's impossible to study, really. It's impossible to have very certain kind of knowledge or theories mirroring reality here. But it could be an important thought trigger to think about how values, the expression and fantasies and hopes around values may function and may be understood. And then you have like interesting examples perhaps of mind stretch through a strong case in this direction. So time is moving to 4 o'clock, and you may feel a bit tired, as I do also. I've been giving a PhD course earlier part of the day, but so let me round off. Also try to get away from the sun in my face here. It's quite sunny here in Sweden today. You may be glad to hear. Anyway, so what do we gain from all this stuff? I do think it's important then to be pluralistic without being too much of laissez-faire or anything goes or fluffy. We need to open up for developing different kinds of knowledge and different kinds of ideas around what is theory. So varied ways of theorizing, where you clarify, this is what I mean by theory, and these are the claims to a contribution that I'm prepared then to accept critical scrutiny for. But then it calls for being relatively clear about what kind of theory is this, what are the criteria that are useful in order to assess this, live up to, and so on. this is important then to contribute to the leveling of the playing field. So now there's a lot of complaints about contemporary academia being quite unfair, much easier perhaps to get quantitative studies published. I'm not saying that is necessarily correct, but sometimes there are these complaints about it's much harder to publish qualitative research, and then the demands for theoretical contributions tend to be very much this explanatory kind of theory. And if I could level the playing field and make it a bit more fair for people with different types of contributions, that's probably a good thing. But people also need to work with clarifying what do we mean by theory, what is actually a theoretical contribution. Now it becomes very kind of often vague and diffuse and contested. And we will need to realize that full clarity of precision, that is perhaps a village in, I don't know, on the moon. So it's quite far away, but we can always work a bit to make it less ambiguous, less vague, and reduce to some extent than the misunderstandings that are often part of all this. So, and with these humble words, then I say thank you, and just mention here the EBRAT series of lectures on methodology for generating ideas and interesting research, which always, in my case, has the ambition to contribute, not to empirically precise, rigorous studies, but to contribute to the generation of ideas. And that is a key element in doing producing theory. So there's a number of lectures which are available on YouTube. And as EBRAT was the motor behind all this, I call them the EBRAT lecture series. So should we open up then for some comments and complaints and questions and whatever?
Yes, thank you, Mats. Thank you very much. This is very interesting and very helpful. Mats, do you mind just stop sharing your slides so we can see you more fully?
We'll stop sharing my slides. Stop sharing.
We already have 3 people raise their hands, and we have a few more questions, both in the YouTube and here on Zoom. We'll try to mix them, do a combination of both. So perhaps let's start with the questions that people raise their hands. Julian, you were the first one to raise. Would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. I'll go first. Hi, thanks for the presentation. Very helpful for me. Just as a bit of background, I started my academic career in Germany, and now I'm in Canada, right? So I obviously see a lot of difference and theorizing between those two. Just to, I started, one of the first academic works I read was Habermas' theory of communicative action, right? And here in Canada, I think I had a sociology course which touched on that, a little bit. But that's about it, right? So I think your typification helped me understand the differences a bit. And maybe for me, if you're so kind, it would be great if you gave me what, your idea of how these different types correspond to the differences in Europe and North America. What your thoughts are on that? That would be very helpful for me.
Yeah, I think that there's a general tendency that in North America, particularly United States, quantitative thinking tends to dominate. So while in parts of it is in Sweden, where I come from, it's a heavily domination in business administration by qualitative work. The same in UK, or used to be. And of course, with qualitative work, you often have an interest in interpretations and some philosophical reasoning and other stuff like that. And that tends to be going against then working with variables and explanations. So there's a lot of variation between different disciplines and different countries, but if one would overgeneralize a bit, I would say that in the United States and North America, it tends to be a bit more quantitative, and then with that follows preferences for certain types of theorizing as well. So I think that in my home country and part of Europe, one is a bit more open to case studies and qualitative work, and then you still can work with the explanations, but it's not necessarily the obvious or natural or self-evident thing to do.
Thank you, Mats. Just a question from the chat. Vartuhi is asking, can the two types of theory development, meaning exploration and explanatory theory development, be combined, actually? Does the one preclude the other? For example, the first part of a theory development would delineate and discuss the meaning of a theory, while the second would raise questions aiming at answering cause-effect relationships among constructs.
Yeah, no, I see this as two, like part of a continuum or extremes. So you often have in all theories some elements of explanations, I would say, and you in all kind of theories and approaches, you have some elements of ordering or often some process elements and so on. So the difference is more that what is the emphasis, the key element in your approach, and of course that tends to some extent influence how do you approach issues like provocation or process, or what kind of distinctions that you work with. So here the idea with the typologies and also bats versus Mets is to point at two clear alternatives, but then you can work with combinations, and you have minor elements of the other also in one relatively extreme or clear-cut version. So yeah, I agree. Yeah, good point. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt. Amel, do we have any questions on the YouTube?
Yes, we do. We have one question that has been raised early in the presentation within the first 10-15 minutes. It's asking, how do you know that what is written is theory and not a mere story?
Yeah, I think that's... I mean, we presented some criteria here, which I think are useful that one could rely on. But I would also say that very strict distinctions here is often tricky. So with all the stuff that we use, what is a credible interpretation? What is a sufficient literature review? What is a kind of theory concept in relationship to an insightful or well-done summary of something? We don't know for sure. I would say that, and some people, even if they're into explanatory theory, they will say that we always do stories. So even the theoretical contribution, it needs to be couched in a story-like way in order to make sense and be read and so on. So, but still, I would say that the theory tends to have some broader bearing, some broader value, and raises a bit in terms of abstractions or seeing possible connections or pointing at less obvious elements. That means that the story becomes, well, a particular kind of story with certain qualities. So I would say that one can still work with a distinction. So even though it's not always a clear-cut case to be made for one or the other.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mats. Mark, would you like to go next?
Wait, Brad, you mean?
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Brad, and thank you, Professor, for your insight. So I see your work to me just like a Google that can help to symbolize and bring all things together in a very simple way to understand. Mike, I have two questions. The first one is, do we also assume one meaning of our theory in your typology are more meaningful or gonna make more contribution to theory rather than the others? And then the second question is, as a PhD student, so how could we use your typology in relation to developing a research question, research design, and then towards the theoretical contribution? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Of course, we all have preferences. So I would say that from my point of view, I think that provocative theory is often more interesting, and they're sometimes very valuable, and they are much needed. But if I control my own preferences and my own prejudice, I would say that one could look at the field and see what is there already and what could we possibly need in terms of alternative approaches, alternative ways of reasoning about phenomena. And then what's valuable is more what adds to what is missing, or if a field is quite locked into a particular way of reasoning, then it's often very good to not just follow and be as conformist as others, but also think differently, and then that sometimes may mean that you, of course, just do different kinds of empirical studies, but it can also mean that you work with different ideas about theories and a theoretical contribution. So that could be one criterion when we think about issues. Okay, how can I add something that others are not doing so much of? And then it could be a clear plus in contributing there. Then as a PhD student, I mean, it's the same. Everybody's struggling with theory. I would say that it's bloody difficult. It's difficult enough to do a good empirical study. And sometimes that's good to do that and not just go out there and interview 40 people, and then you summarize what they've told you, and then you have some people say like that, and some people say like that, and third category say something else, and these are my kind of patterns or findings. That is sometimes not so easy to get that to hang together and lead to something. But and then it's the next step is then to get something out of this in terms of a more general, abstract understanding. That means that even a clever person that has thought about this gets some new concepts, some new ideas, some support for the way of reasoning. And that is very difficult. I do think that our methodologies that we have proposed, I mentioned here on my last slide, and that are available on YouTube. I think that these are some support for all this. But then you need to find some good examples, read a bit more broadly, talk to people. I think the key element is very much getting the good idea, and then sort that out and systematize and relate that to others and clarify this further and makes it more than a half-baked, loose idea. That's also demanding. But I do think that the good idea is the crucial element. And then there are various kinds of tricks, from following our and others' methodologies to try sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or work together with a genius.
Thank you, Professor. May I have one more follow-up question?
Yes.
I remember you have one earlier paper about problematization as a way to approach theory. Is that right? Compared to gap spotting. So from your presentation today, I equate that paper to the provoking meaning as one of the typology. Am I correct? So problematization is a way to kind of produce a provoking theory. Yeah, and if it is correct, so how could we start?
Yeah.
We start with something to challenge the assumptions, common assumptions first, or we start with a good idea first and then do empirical work? Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I mean, you can do both, and I mean, we have two pieces published in Academy of Management Review, 2007 and 2011, and one of them is very much this assumption challenging, problematize, and then you look at established knowledge, and then you see if there are alternatives based on assumptions that are not really considered in the field. And then you may get the good alternative idea to what's conventional. But you can also use empirical impressions as triggers. So these are, I think, the two major alternatives. If you're not interested in the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or whatever other ways in order to get the good ideas. So you can work with this in very many different ways. But I would say also that assumption challenging and creation, working with empirical triggers, creating mysteries and so on, that can be useful for all kind of research, not only provocative theory, but also the other ones. So I think that these ideas, they have broader reach, but spontaneously it may be an extra good fit with provocative theories that you are pointing at here. So.
Thank you very much, Professor. By the way, I'm residing in Turku, Finland, quite close to you. Thank you very much. Hope to see you.
Okay, that's nice to hear. So perhaps see you in Scandinavia at one point. So, okay. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Matt. We have quite a few hands raised in Zoom. Let's take a couple more questions before we switch to the chat questions. Navaditha, I think you are the next one to have raised your hand. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, good evening, Professor Matt. Thanks for the nice way in which you had structured the theory and explained. Just a simple question. Is there any paper which talks about this 5 types of theory so that we can refer to them as we do our research and do our publication? So that's the question. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I started by showing the reference here. So I can just very briefly then move back to this. And here is the reference once again. Can you see it? Journal of Management Studies 58-2, so it's just appeared. Meanings of theory, clarifications through typology. So not everything that I talked about today is covered there, but 5 typologies, they are there. So.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Thanks. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Prof?
Yes, I was wondering, so there is this work, of course, that we all know on episteme, techne, and phronesis, kind of like as a typology of knowledge. How would you say does this typology of theory that you're talking about relate to this earlier, so to say, idea of a typology of knowledge? And specifically, and I think that relates nicely to the question on X-ray research, like what's the role of phronesis in this perspective on theory that you're developing here?
I must confess that I forget these concepts, so you need to remind me about the meaning of them.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So that is the yeah.
Let me try to explain. So maybe I get it wrong. Then please correct me. So episteme is, so to say, epistemology, the why of theory, so to say. The techne is more the how. So to say, how can I use that knowledge? And the phronesis is more about what to do in specific situations. It's kind of like practical wisdom. And that one of the critiques of a lot of theory is that, yeah, while it explains to you the why, it doesn't really explain to you the how and the what. And that a lot of what's missing in academic research is exactly the phronesis, so to say, what do we do with this knowledge?
Yeah, no, I do think that it's a relatively loose connection between the typology and these different kind of uses or ways of relating to the stuff. So helpful in a large number of different ways, although in some cases the steps between the theories and then how exactly they are used in terms of good judgment and backup for that and so on. So I would say there's no easy or direct relationship, but a lot of theories, they relatively abstract and sterile and not that much of use for a person trying to find out how to use this. But I would say that if it's a good theory, there should be at least some support for how to relate to the problems that you are addressing in a practical situation. So I would say that there's a loose and weak relationship, and then it varies enormously between different types of stuff. So I would say that when it comes to provocative theory, I would say that sometimes one application or one effect of all this could be that you don't do so bloody much. Most organizations, they are characterized by them being overmanaged. You should have systems and structures and solutions and policies and expertise and so on for every bloody problem that appears. And sometimes that the solution to problem, they feeds into their own problems. So you may solve one problem, but you create two others. And then there's no easy answer in terms of how, if people want to have another technique to fix something. But sometimes the how to relate to reality aspect is very much a matter of being a bit more relaxed and realize that shit will always happen. And if we at all the time try to minimize this, then we probably create even more shit. So in that sense, a theory can be helpful in thinking through how we should do with problems, but also what kind of problems that are there as part of human nature or the notorious imperfections of contemporary complex life. So if theory can be used and they are relevant and they are thoughtful and they are thought-provoking and they can point in either connections or make it possible for us to make fine-tuned distinctions and think sharp about issues, I would say that they have some relevance for a lot of different types of situations and issues. But there's no simple kind of connection as I see it.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you, Fridtjof. Thank you, Mats. We have one question that I think Anna Maria asked in the chat, and quite a few people seem to be interested in that question as well. So Anna Norinder, if you don't mind, can we just jump to Anna Maria before coming back to you? Anna Maria, would you like to ask your question?
Perhaps you need to unmute yourself. That's easy to forget.
Okay, maybe we'll come back to Anna Maria later. Anna Norinder, do you want to go next?
Yeah, first, thank you, Mats. Really fascinating and very useful, and also great opportunity to have live session. I interpret that you here have done an ordering theory of theory. And on the same theme there, you know, your head starts spinning a little bit. When you do these comprehending theory, and I thought it was interesting with your HRM system there in consulting, you could of course also see that phenomenon as a symptom of something or as some kind of element in a system or in another phenomenon. So how do you know if you're really doing comprehending theory or if you're sort of some kind of explaining, but not maybe what you set out to explain, but rather in another system?
Yeah, I mean, you can stretch your theoretical idea in different directions. So depending on how you frame it, what stuff that you relate to, and how you kind of push forward your contributions. So it's very easy to sometimes to move something in another direction, and sometimes you feel that you have to go in an explanatory direction, even if that's not your preference. The preference because there is this dominant view on theory. And the theoretical contribution is explanatory in different ways. And I remember that we have at least had one paper where we've added boxes and arrows, which I did not really perhaps like that much, but my co-author found it was okay. So sometimes we push it slightly in that direction, and sometimes it's very much how you frame it. So this the Met example with the HRM system and the large management IT consulting firm, one could push that even further than as provocation, and then ask all this kind of people improvement that we are all into. Perhaps that is not only storytelling and identity construction, that can also be seen as how we control people and then make us all into victims or subjectified individuals being the imprints of particular regulatory regimes that at the end of the day makes us run like hell doing rather peculiar and meaningless work. So we could have, if we wanted to, have stretched that approach much more into provocation type of theory approach. So that would be a possibility. And here, in some cases, you don't have to be crystal clear exactly what you're doing, as long as you can convince the reader that here is something that stands above and lead to some more wider insights or help with qualified reasoning, accounting for conceptualizing a particular type of phenomena, going beyond then the empirical study. But there are options, and sometimes it can be a clear plus if you are placing your approach more distinctly into one particular notion about theory and theorizing.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Anna-Maria, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you. My question is how to theorize from an action research intervention. Thank you.
Well, you can theorize from absolutely everything. And then I do think that when it comes to theorizing, it's important then to see what is of theoretical interest. And not necessarily, as quite common, we summarize everything going on here, or we try to have a holistic description of everything that's been involved in. So in action research, I guess that a lot of things they have, I mean, you can't see the theoretical point of this. It's helpful for people, and it leads to certain outcomes. Normally it's not as optimal as you would have hoped for. But there may be interactions, there may be episodes, there may be ingredients in all this, there may be asides to everything that's happening here that can work as a theoretical trigger. There may be a mystery, something unexpected, and then you use that as a key element in an effort to produce a theoretical contribution. And that can be a minor part of everything. I remember I wrote a paper once with Hugh Wilmot on identity, on how management control is working, and that is through identity regulation. And the trigger was an observation that my PhD student was doing of a senior manager, vice president, informing middle-level managers of an organization restructuring. And he started the meeting, but I gathered 100 middle-level managers, started like this. Why are you here? Because you are managers in this division. And then I decided I'll go through this in detail, the entire 2-hour meeting. Who is there? How do they enter? How do they sit? How much space do they get in terms of talking and so on? And I just thought about what's happening here. Why is he telling them that? And then I thought, this is about exercise of power. It's very much about regulating identities. So if you make people see that they are defined in a particular way, yes, I'm a manager. I'm not just a junior person here. I'm not a member of the union belonging to that department or whatever, but I'm a manager. I'm sitting here with other managers. I belong to we in this division. Then you regulate people's identities. And then, of course, that has effects. So I say to you, you are scholars. Yes, we are. And then you should do theory and be bold and so on. But if I say you, I guess most of you are, or many of you are PhD students. That's an alternative identity regulation. And this has effects, and that is maybe a cornerstone, at least in my case it was. We wrote this article on identity management control as identity regulation, and then developed a theory about this, which actually is, I think, the second most cited paper in Journal Management Studies ever. So this small trigger was then used as a way of producing a theoretical contribution. And sometimes we should be a bit liberated from all empirics, from the actions and other things going on there, and then see what may be an effective trigger for an idea, or slice all the action research that you may do in such a way so that it has some theoretical bearings. But that may mean that you forget about 90% of what goes on and take the 10% that is really of interest and has some theoretical potential. And here we need to work, what is the phenomenon? And it may not be an organizational change. It may be a particular conflict or gendering about people being involved, or how discourse runs the show, or how identity regulation is taking place, or how people are doing subordinateship, or how they're doing sabotage, or whatever. So there may be something in all the things going on here that is the interesting phenomena with some theoretical potential. But that may be very different than from trying to summarize all the kind of uninteresting things that you encounter in your, or we all encounter in our research projects.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna Maria. Emel, do you have any questions from YouTube?
Yes, we have two questions that are related to each other. So I'm going to ask them together. One of them is, what advice would you give to new scholars who are engaging with non-dominant types of theory in their papers? How to ensure a good reviewer match? Because then the other question continues that what happens if the reviewer does not agree with the theory that is argued in the paper? How can you prepare somebody for a challenging review process? Thank you.
Well, preparing for the process, well, you should have your drugs and good friends and straitjacket if you become too upset about all this in preparation. So when you get the message from the journal, then you should open it in company of your friends or your shrink, perhaps. But otherwise, I mean, what we could do is do as good work as possible. That is always the challenge, and it's always wrong with people who don't understand, or they don't appreciate, or they're not supportive enough. But in 98% of all cases, it's not wrong with others; it's wrong with us, because it is difficult to do research. Too much has been done already, almost, and then to add something new that is worth publishing. I mean, it's really a miracle. If we take management studies, there probably are 100 or 200,000 studies published already. And then what do you add to this? It's not so easy. It is fully possible. There's a lot of opportunities out there, but it's not so easy. So we need to work quite hard, read, think, use our resources, try to be a bit self-critical and reflexive, not being too conventional. But yeah, so we need to do all this. But then sometimes you have something that is really good, and then people don't you get some support for the idea that this is really good, but you are unfair journal, or make sure that the fit between what they normally like to publish and what you are doing, they seem to be a good fit. But often it's good to get feedback from people before you submit something, and don't submit something prematurely. Premature submissions, particularly if it's like a journal which have a lot of choices in terms of what to reject and what to publish, then you need to be quite well prepared, and good feedback from your friends and from your enemies, not extreme enemies, but people that can be a bit devil's advocate and are not just supportive and positive and so on. That is very valuable.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. There's a couple of questions that are related that I'd like to read out from the chat. Shilpa is asking, so of the 5 typologies that you presented, can these types overlap, and can one type move to the other? And then related to this question is by Emily, is it possible to combine some of these approaches in one single paper?
Yeah, well, typology is always working with ideal types. So these are like a point at what is typical for the various ways of approaching things. So it's not like reflection of how people normally do this. You look at all the messiness and variations that is out there, and then see here is one type of orientation, and this seems to be another, and so on. But in many cases, then it's not particularly clear or not so strongly in line with this typology. So you can do things in a lot of different ways. And sometimes there are examples that are very difficult to plug into any of these 5, or there may be other options as well. So there's a combinations in different ways. And sometimes you have like kind of weak interpretive approaches, which is some combination between explanatory and comprehensive. So that's sometimes the case with at least some case studies where you move between these, and you may have explanatory approaches, and then they explain process elements. For example, how come that they did this process, or what's happening if this process gets started? How come that we have to do gender, for example? And that's one approach, that we are doing gender. Gender is not like a trait, a role, a structural characteristic. It is an interactional accomplishment, some people will say. So we tend to do gender when we are acting. Not all the time, not necessarily stereotypical, but dress and way of speaking, smiling, looking a bit more masculine and stern, or working with number crunching, or whatever we can do in order to demonstrate some level of masculinity or some level of femininity. Not overdo this, but do it to some extent. Of course, then in order to understand how people are doing gender, you can point at, okay, this is the context. This is a professional context, then you perhaps do gender as a female, not with extremely long hair and a lot of makeup and a lot of very feminine dressing. You try to minimize but not totally avoid signs of femininity. That may be the case. And then you can see that here is a context where there are elements of demands for some masculinity or gender neutrality, which leads to certain perhaps consequences in the doings of gender. So you can, in that sense, combine your main focus, understanding how this is being done, and then you incorporate some perhaps explanatory dimensions, or some typological ordering ingredients, because you may look at this here in different academic disciplines, or compare that explicitly or implicitly with other professions or other industries or other organizations, and you can see that the doings of gender, which is mainly a processual enactment kind of approach, that can also be related to context that can be seen as this, to some extent, something that explains, through some light on the long answer, but yes, you can combine, and people often do that. This very kind of strict typological versions that I presented, they are just pointing at options, helping us think about this, as any ordering theories, and I think was pointing out, are useful for. But the idea is not to optimize the description of exactly what people are doing in practice.
Thank you, Mats. Yoko, you had your hand raised earlier. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor, for the very fascinating discussion. My question is actually related to the one that just discussed. Just sort of in the context of that, could you please comment a little bit more further on the process of theorizing in a qualitative research, in the sense that you mentioned that yes, indeed, different approaches to the theorizing, or the sort of different typology of theorizing types can be combined and could happen. But could we also say that the qualitative data that we are collecting, say from interviews and so forth, are actually dictating what types of theorizing would be a good suit, rather than we set off having a very sort of firm view that okay, I'm going to apply this, say, comprehensive approach or comprehensive theory or provocative theory in order to and then starting to collect the data from interviews and so forth. So the point is that that data is probably the driver, rather than kind of theoretical concepts of the approaches that we might take. Sorry, it's a slightly sort of badly framed.
No, I mean it's always this interaction, and I would say that all data tend to be theory impregnated. So we have theoretical ideas and assumptions and paradigmatic and ideological commitments, and then when we ask questions tend to bear imprints of all this. So in that sense, theories often are built into the data that we produce. So you go out there and you ask people about gender. Of course, then you have an idea that gender is significant. And some people say, of course, that's significant. Well, not necessarily, not always, not in all respects. So it could be seen as an open question. And then if you have the gender that is male or female, and you choose people based on that kind of distinction, rather than you say that I have another theory here and I'm interested in people that are very kind of male and very female, and those that seems to be biological males working with soft data, qualitative method or something like that are not really males, perhaps, or I don't know, but you kind of open up this and work with gender in different ways depending on your theoretical ideas about gender. And even if you don't have any sophisticated thinking here, but you assume that there are males and females, and some people are perhaps more transsexual or open-minded or processual or whatever, then there's always some idea of what do we mean by men and women? What do we mean by gender? And that needs to be communicated when we try to produce data. So in that sense, theory is always part of what we are doing. And we ask people about HRM in a company. Of course, they need to have some idea what in hell is HRM, or appraisal interviews, or feedback, or promotion, or career, or work environment issues, or whatever. So that's probably an idea that I got from studying at a business school, where they have learned about theories about theorem, and then they're out there in the corporations that we're studying. So the relationship between theory and empirics is much more complicated and multidimensional. And this means that we need to be aware of that when we are doing the studies. But then even if you have an empirical material, you can approach that in very different ways. And any kind of empirical material can then, in principle, be theorized from different angles. In principle, then it may be less strong. Often it's a bit weak and a bit thin, which means that it's difficult to produce theory from a lot of empirical materials because it tends to be a bit flat. I normally recommend an ethnographic work, which you have a much richer empirical material. You make observations, you interview people, and so on. And then you have a stronger empirical resource base for developing theory. And then it becomes a bit easier. But in principle, I would say that almost any kind of data can be used for most theoretical purposes. Then how far they reach, then it's another issue, and often they don't reach that far. So we need to use our imagination. And sometimes the data is more interesting, like as a trigger, not as a firm foundation then for making a grounded theory. So that's very different. And we do empirical work, but that's very much in order to use that as a trigger and as a correction mechanism for stupid ideas and misunderstandings, more than this is a very strong, grounded, firm case then for making a theoretical contribution. So you can see empirical material in different ways. But then, of course, if it's explanatory theory, then that tends to call for a bit more of robust empirical work that is a bit more constrained and may allow then explanations compared to, for example, provocative theory, where you can just get an idea out of any material. Then, of course, the challenge is to have the good idea. It can be really demanding, and then you need to use other resources than the collecting and sorting of the empirical material. So,
yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jouko. Thank you, Mats. Emil, do you have any more questions?
We have one more question on the YouTube chat, and it is referring to the HRM discussion earlier in your presentation, Professor. So the question goes as follows: using boxes and arrows theory or meaning exploration theory or the HRM system cited in your presentation, can we then imply that a working digital system built out of the causal relationships identified is a living theory versus those that are not identified, not implemented, not used, a dead theory? And how can we write about it?
I think that I probably need to hear the question once more because it seems to be a complicated one. So, Emil, if you could repeat the question, I can get some more time to think about it. Yes.
So the question is around a working digital system built out of the causal relationships. Can we do we classify it as a living theory versus a dead theory? And when we are doing this classification, how can we use the boxes and arrows theory, meaning exploration theory, or the HRM system cited?
Well, I don't know if I have any particular experience with digital systems. I think that this is very general. But in terms of dead and live, then I think that's good metaphors, and we need that's a general. I think. Consideration that we need to consider, and that is the relationship between dead and living metaphors. And the problem with a lot of theorizing is that people are overusing dead metaphors. metaphors that have been in operation for far too long, and we tend to reify and use them as givens rather than something that opens up and have this quality of a live metaphor. We are aware of the metaphorical qualities and we fully use them. And of course, a good metaphor that can be related to provocative theory, because a good metaphor, it makes us think and rethink through elements of absurdity and making sense and being credible at the same time. So I don't know if I can answer the question, but live metaphors, I think that is something that we should try to work with much more. And in general, in terms of theorizing, come up with the interesting metaphors, and you are partly on your way then to produce something that may have some theoretical value. Of course, metaphors is also used in boxes and arrow theories, but people tend to be more constrained there. Typologists that can be working with a variety of different metaphors, but even more so with provocative theories, that the use of metaphors can be really valuable.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
Marwa, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Matt, so much for this so interesting talk. It's very, very useful. I have a question with regard to leadership studies, and you have published a number of papers in this regard. And one of them, with regard to critical leadership studies, and in which you argue that sometimes we use leadership to fit all, to catch all solution for nearly anything. And you suggested in these papers that we should adjust our ways of data collection and doing ethnographic studies to learn more about leadership, because the way we conceptualize leadership seems more to be more a fantasy. And I would like to ask you, from your grand expertise, about a recommendation or advice if with regard to the future of theorizing leadership, and which one of the category do you think it will help for future research? You have discussed a number of different approaches in terms of theory typology. So it would be great if you helped me in this regard.
Well, I do think that you can work with any idea about theory in different ways in relationship to leadership or whatever. But leadership is one of these over-researched. I mean, it's a combination of being over-researched and not being researched at all, which is relatively common, actually. Over-research in the sense that there are tens of thousands of papers of leadership, and people are desperately trying to carve out another niche to spend a few years studying. So in that sense, it's over-researched. In another sense, I think that most studies that tend to be studies of people's questionnaire feeling behavior, or how psychology and management students, they act in artificial and simplified situations, experiments, or how managers, they produce moral storytelling when interviewed about leadership. So they're not really about leadership per se, but in order to understand and study this, you need to probably make interviews with managers, interviews with their subordinates, see if leadership is like the right label or right approach to this, and also perhaps to make some observations and know really what goes on here. And then that can lead to explanatory theories or process theories or whatever. But it's important to think what kind of theory that I like to contribute to, and then having some kind of design implications follow from all this. But my recommendation is to do more in-depth ethnographic work where you combine then considering ideas about leadership, but also considering limitations here and being open for what goes on here. And that may be something quite different. And we tried to study leadership. We see very little signs of this. And something else going on, admin, kind of more equal kind of relations, efforts to nudge and convince and so on, but not so much of this leadership. That may be because we are lucky or unlucky, but hanging around and see what goes on here, and then be a bit more open-minded about what kind of phenomena can I study here, and consider leadership, but also consider other options. I think that is possibly good advice. And sometimes we can study things like leadership fantasies, leadership talk, moral storytelling, leadership as the tranquilizer, as a Prozac for people doing boring and stressful managerial job. And then you can take comfort in either having a whiskey after work, or you read a leadership best-selling book, and then you fantasize about, oh, I'm a great leader. I ask my colleagues, my junior people, how they are, or I eat last, and therefore I'm an ethical or supportive or caring manager. That's an interesting phenomenon that one can study, but then you need to have like perhaps an ordering approach to all this. Leadership, it may be a practice, it may be a relation, it may be a hope, it may be fantasy, it may be replacement, a surrogate for drinking too much.
Oh, thank you so much. This is so helpful.
Okay, thank you. And here, humor and irony, I think, is an important part of all this. Just because we are doing research, it doesn't mean that we have to be boring. We can be a bit entertaining and ironic also in our approach. And life is full of funny incidents and so on. We don't have to make it so gray and boring as we sometimes do in our research projects.
Thank you, Matt. And thank you, Mara, for asking a question. Sachin, I can see you have your hand raised. Would you like to go next?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, Professor, my question is about how we choose a perspective, like theoretical perspective. I will take example. We study innovation. So we study the nature of innovation also and how innovation occurs. Simultaneously, we are studying the phenomena and the mechanism. So in my understanding, it's an understanding of process itself and the explaining also and describing. So how we choose what particular approach is suitable. So it's a combination of all, or is it distinct approaches at the time that we can choose?
Well, I mean, there are two options here. One is that you say that I'm very interested in this. This is my choice. I'm interested in working with fine-tuning, distinctions, typologies, and so on. And then of course, you become competent in working with that idea of theory. And then you try to look for empirical phenomena that is in line with this, and that can further then develop the kind of contribution that they aim for. So one is that you decide. And it's partly a matter of investment in reading and thinking, and also self-identity. I'm that kind of person which has certain preferences and so on. And then you read a lot of Mintzberg and what's his name, Uchi and other researchers that have done good typologies. And then you cultivate that kind of mindset and experience. That's one option, that you start from their theoretical commitment to a particular type of theorizing and become competent in that. And then you proceed with flexibility, and you don't have to be dogmatic in your approach. That is one approach. The other is that you're interested in what goes on there. You look at different kinds of theories and ideas and so on. And then you see what seems to be a good combination of the empirical material that you are working with, the general ideas that you got, the theories that you are familiar with and think that could be further developed through this kind of empirical material. And then it's more empirically triggered, or it's a combination of different types of approaches. But so you can do this in a large number of different ways. And sometimes you have the approach that is relatively clear-cut, ideal, typical, like, and in some other cases, it's not so easy to categorize it in relationship to the ideal types or the typologies being proposed. So there are a lot of options here for how to do this. And one can't produce a particular recipe. I think that is sometimes important to remember, that life is full of difficult choices and we have to make them for ourselves. And there's a lot of different opportunities and ways of working. So we can't really say that this is how to do it, follow a particular formula. In grounded theory, they have their formula, and then you can try to work with that if one is interested. But otherwise, I'm more interested in proposing a number of options. And with any set of options, then there's some help in decision making, but they can also be a bit constraining. So it's not necessarily so that I have to choose between 5 ways of theorizing or 4 sociological paradigms or whatever. Sometimes it's more interesting if one breaks away from these suggestions. So use them in order to think further a bit, and then see if you can also find another synthesis or another way of addressing the phenomena, and be creative in the process.
So summarizing this, like if I'm able to justify the argument, any approach is okay.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
The trick is to have the well-formulated, well-thought, credible, justified argument. So that is the trick.